Well, Redwall is a bit like a dance where you take one step forward and then 2 steps back, which is not good. Cheers. Welcome, my friends, to the 8th day of Mousemas, where we talk about Outcast of Redwall by Brian Jacques from 1996. And we'll do the usual thing where I talk about the book, what it is, quickly. Then you can go and read it if you feel like it. And then I complain about stuff with spoilers, because there are some and I have stuff to complain about. Nice, isn't it? Alright, let's get started. Outcast of Redwall takes place after the events of Mossflower, which I mean all the way back in the beginning of the Redwall timeline, more or less. And it takes place mostly around the parts that are Salamandastron, because it is about badgers, among other things. In fact, the main badger character is Sunflash, the mace, whom we have seen arrive at Salamandastron at the end of Mossflower, where he takes over after his grandfather, Boar the Fighter. So this is where we are timeline-wise. What is it about? Well, it is about Sunflash's life all the way until he comes to the mountain, and what he does when he's at the mountain, and his fight with Six Claws Thwart, the Weasel Warlord, and their ongoing feud, which is sort of the main storyline. It is also about Six Claws' son, Vale, and some life that he has in Redwall Abbey before he has to go and find his father, and what happens then. That's mostly the plotline here, and it does do the usual Redwall things. If you are looking for those, you will find them in this book. It unfortunately also takes some steps or talks about some things that I am somewhat troubled, which is what we'll talk about now that we enter the spoiler zone. Alright, let's start with the good bits though, because there are some good bits in this specific book, and that's what I want to focus on first. So, last video I talked about in the Bellmaker, I talked about how Brian Jacques is really good at taking certain elements, tropes, parts of classic fiction, mythology, those kind of things, and put them into his books and adapt them into a very specific Redwall version of themselves. And Salamandastron, well, not Salamandastron, but Outcast of Redwall is no different from that, in that the life of Sunflash the Mace feels very much, once again, like a lot of these elements that we might know from mythology or certain other parts of storytelling. We find his life beginning as a slave. He has no name. His friend gives him a name. He decides to adopt that specific name. He goes out and goes on a quest until he has a dream that tells him that he has to find Salamandastron, the Fire Lizard Mountain. On the way there, he does all kinds of interesting things. For example, he decides to become a farmer, because that's what he's really good at. And this, I think, is really interesting with Sunflash in particular, because we have had different badgers in these books before. And there's basically 2 types of badger. On the one hand, there is the stern badger warlord who lives in Salamandastron, rules it, and defends Mossflower country from sea rats and other vermin. That's the one type. It's, your Boar the Fighter. It is technically, I guess, Lord Brocktree, although I haven't, met him yet, and some of those. And then there are, obviously, the badgers living in and around Redwall. That is Sunflash's mother, being, Bella, for example, Constance in the first Redwall book, Mara becoming one of those badgers. And though they are more like motherly, they are caring, they usually deal with, well, they're still stern in a lot of ways, but they deal with, teaching the children, caring for the young children in Redwall Abbey and so forth. And Sunflash has both of these characteristics. On the one hand, he becomes obviously a big fighter. He has the berserker rage of badgers. He has all of these aspects. He has his mace, and he does the war stuff really well, but he also is really good at the caring stuff. He wants to work as a farmer. He starts planting fields and orchards and so forth around Salamandastron before, obviously, Six Claws shows up and ravishes everything, and he reorders the mountain Salamandastron, deciding who can be, to be a ruler there. In truth, we see more of the Salamandastron society. He tells, someone to become the new cook, because clearly the cook doesn't actually want to cook, but wants to become a cellar master and brew cider and stuff and beer. And he takes all of these elements. In particular, he is good with children and tries to play with children and so forth. And I think that's a really interesting approach here, to kind of take those two elements and combine them into one character. And what with Redwall being really, interesting when it comes to, say, gender roles. We have had a lot of like fighting animals like Marielle and so forth, where we have female characters fulfilling roles that are traditionally often seen as masculine, and we have had male characters take over roles that are often seen more as female or domestic, with a lot of people becoming healers or cooks and so forth in a lot of these ways. And now we have a character that does basically embody both of these gender roles in one character, and I think that once again shows that Brian Jacques is really good at seeing humans, or seeing characters in general, as multifaceted, that can have these different aspects to who they want to be and what they want to do, and sometimes having to obviously come to terms with the fact they can't necessarily be the kind of character that society expects them to be, and so forth. And that, I think, is really well done. Also seeing a bit more of Salamandastron in peacetime, and seeing it reordered, and having Sunflash explore the mountain, coming to that to the hole up in the hill where the stuff is written in the walls, where you have all the carvings in the wall that explain history and so forth. That is really cool, because we see more of Salamandastron and how it is somewhat mystical in a lot of ways. Badgers being the mystical animals for whatever reason. I don't know why Brian Jacques decided to settle on badgers there, but there is a mystical element to Redwall in general. What with, say, the power of dreams, we obviously had people dreaming and having visions of Martin the warrior, but we also had badgers creating visions when we had the whole scene of Earthstripe where we had Earthstripe put like herbs on, burn herbs, and in that mystic trance he started carving his own future into the mountain. We've had that before as well. So dreams being very important here, I think, is interesting. And we see that obviously with badgers in particular, when Sunflash is bitten by the adders and is lying in his coma, and he first meets in his dream, and I want to talk about that sequence in general because it does interesting things, but he also speaks to his mother in dreams, and Bella is very much clear that she also talked in that dream, so that mystical connection is something that badgers in particular seem to have for one reason or another. Now let's talk a bit quickly about that whole forest scene, the dark forest scene, when Sunflash is wounded and he is obviously very near death. He goes to dark forest, and I still really appreciate or really like the term dark forest for death or wherever it is that animals go after they die. And this time it becomes quite literally the thing that he has in his sort of near-death experience, right? He walks up to dark forest and he finds it restful, and he wants to just go there and rest. And that's really a very wholesome approach to the idea of death. And there he meets, of course, his grandfather and his great-grandfather, those being Lord Brock and, of course, Bor the Fighter. And they, in full armor, forbid him to enter the forest, because he has to go back to Salamandastron and become the new Badger Lord there. And that is really, really interesting, because it is another sort of like mystical, or in this case more like a mythical, of course, experience as well, or a trope that we have from different myths around the world, where some hero has to go down to the kingdom of death and he talks to departed spirits. We have that in the Odyssey, when Odysseus talks to the soul of Achilles, who's not exactly happy in the underworld. We have had like a lot of these stories, so having one of them with that specific experience of like, this is not yet for you, you have to come back, works really well, because it does add that epic or mythic character to an element to the larger Redwall universe. And that's something that I, generally find really well done. The next part is, of course, the idea of Salamandastron and the Badger Lord. Something I find interesting there is, obviously, we have seen that before with Redwall having the female badger often living there and doing stuff there, and we have had the sort of stern badger lords in Salamandastron. What I think is important here is another aspect, that places in Redwall, in the Redwall universe, do have almost like a local spirit. Some places have like a spirit, a genius loci, so to speak, right? Where in Redwall Abbey, that is, of course, Martin the Warrior, who in times of need appears in dreams and slowly guides the people living in Redwall. And that does embody, in a way, Redwall Abbey as well, defensible, but also very peaceful and peace-loving and so forth. Whereas in Salamandastron, that is the sort of like Badger Lord, and whoever takes over that role fulfills that specific role in a way that goes beyond just being, a lord, badger lord, but being sort of the spirit of Salmandastron, of the mountain, and that is a much sterner, more defensive sort of spirit, right? The role of Salmandastron is, of course, to protect all of Mossflower Country from the sea rats and other hordes that constantly attack Salmandastron. And it is a role that is needed because the land does need that specific role, does need that specific defender, in a way that Redwall Abbey maybe does need other sort of like characters. And I think Brian Jacques is really good at having places sort of have a specific character and embody that. And I think, in a way, we see that with the quest that Sunflash goes on. And I think the whole idea of Sunflash having to go through these different trials and adventures until he becomes the person who is capable of taking that mountain, basically, is a really interesting one, right? It reminds me a bit of the story of Theseus in Greek mythology, who, when he decides to go to his father's kingdom, that being Athens there, has to go through all these different trials and face all these different bandits and so forth. And we have a similar thing, of course, with Heracles as well, but I think Theseus is the better model here for Sunflash. And I just think that is really well done, what Brian Jacques does there. Now, there are also things that I don't necessarily like, and we'll talk about them in a minute. One final thing that I thought was really well done in this one is we see more of the food preparation. We have, obviously, the Kestrel help the moles in that mole house with making cheese, and we don't talk about why all the raptors, being good birds, apparently are also vegetarians, which, yeah, sure, nice. But the thing I wanted to look at is songs. Now, throughout the series, there have come more and more songs in each book. And Brian Jacques, in this one, I think, manages to more and more integrate them into the story and not just have them as, songs that have to be in there because it's children's books, right? So what he did already in The Bellmaker, where there was the singing competition that gave us the really funny pirate song and at Redwall Abbey, what we see this time around is, of course, the Salmandastron song, which has different anagrams of Salmandastron in the song, and is the riddle. So another Redwall thing that we have often seen is, of course, riddle poems in a lot of ways. And we see those come up again and again, but this time around the riddle is a song, and it then guides, of course, after he has the dream vision, it guides Sunflash to Salmandastron. Another fun thing I found was we see the riddle game this time around, the same way that we have hobbits play the riddle game in, say, the Hobbit, of course, were famously. We have Sunflash with the couple of otters that he works with, that he helps with or travels with at some point, play the riddle game just for riddles. And I found that interesting because it once again shows that Brian Jacques is certainly aware of specific traditions, that riddle game kind of thing being obviously something that a lot of cultures have. In this specific case, of course, it sounds once again fairly British, because of course it does. Anyway, so that's the good bit. Now let's talk about why I think the book left me somewhat conflicted, but also is not necessarily as strong as some of the recent books that we've talked about in the Redwall series. And that is the Vale plotline. Vale is, of course, Six Claws' son, and while we have the whole revenge plotline between Sunflash and Six Claws, and them basically fighting each other and having like almost mirrored lives, Vale ends up as a small child in Redwall Abbey and is cared for by mice. The first part is like just construction-wise, I don't think it works really well because it feels almost tacked on to the story. It happens fairly late in the book is when Vale gets actually born, and then he gets raised incredibly quickly at Redwall Abbey, and suddenly the story becomes about Vale and no longer about Sunflash trying to do Sunflash things, and of course Six Claws trying to do Six Claws things, but suddenly it is about a very different story. It almost feels like Brian Jacques had two stories and tried to combine them into one book, which would have probably made for better books if he had like written two different books about those things and had taken the Vale plotline for its very own sort of book and not sort of cram it in there near the end. It gives the book a feeling of being somewhat unbalanced, and that's the first part that I wanted to talk about. The other part is, of course, the actual content of the Vale plotline, right? See, Vale, being a weasel, is, of course, brought up in Redwall Abbey. The question is, does he become evil or not? And that's something I find frustrating, because in the last book, when we talked about the Bellmaker, I was very happy with the way the storyline about Blackguard the Sea Rat is explored and how you can actually become a good character, being, well, morally good, and decides to become a boat builder and all of that. That's really good. I really appreciated that because it kind of broke with the world building until then, which means that like some species are just inherently evil. Now, the Vale plotline does very clearly, openly ask that question. Some characters actually phrase it that way, are wondering about the question whether a weasel that is, evil or has, a lot of evil weasels are evil. If one character like that can, in fact, become good. And the answer seems to be no. So it contradicts what happened in the previous book. Now, I want to go through this in 2 steps because I think there is an easy reading, which I'm not defending, which is the one that I just mentioned already. And then there is a more complicated reading. And I would argue that if that story would have been explored as an entire book and not just as part of a larger story in this one, it may have worked better. So let's start with the open reading, right? Vale grows up, he's treated by mice and so forth, but he is evil. He steals and he starts, causing even more mischief and poisoning someone for all kinds of reasons. And then he gets thrown out and he ends up with his father, and then he dies. We'll talk about the death in a second. So the answer here would be yes, he is in fact evil. And that's supposedly was what his mother, so to speak, or teacher, that being Briony the mouse, believes or says she believes at the end. But there is, I think, a second way this could be looked at. That is that no creature is in fact evil at its core, but it depends on a lot of things around, like our surrounding. It is nurture over nature, the way that Blackguard's story in The Bellmaker would suggest. Now, one thing that we learn is that everyone constantly suspects Vale to be the person causing mischief in Redwall Abbey simply because he is a weasel. People believe weasels to be evil. Now, we can argue about that, but yes, living under negative racist prejudice and stereotypes can lead people into acting out those stereotypes. That's certainly one thing that happens in our world as well. So we could argue that Vale turns into into an evil creature because everyone believes him to be evil and tells him that he is evil. And there are elements in his story, in the way he talks about stuff, that does somewhat go in that direction and allow that specific reading. And then there is, of course, the situation that at the end of the story, he seemingly sacrifices his life to save Briony, right? When the spear is thrown at Briony, he jumps in front of the spear and is killed. And then tells Briony while dying that she should go back to Redwall Abbey, which is peaceful and so forth. And that is one way of reading this. But then Briony claims that no, he didn't actually do that when Bella apologized for suggesting that Vale might be evil, and says, well, I guess he did sacrifice himself for you, so he was good after all, and I was wrong, I'm sorry for that. And says, no, in fact, I don't think that was what happened. He would not have sacrificed himself if there had been another option and so forth. Now, the problem here is that this reading that we are explicitly told by Briony, would suggest, a very negative thing. On the other hand, we could, of course, argue, and these are me trying to defend things or figuring out ways this could, in fact, be different, like that it is her dealing with grief by going, well, he was evil, so I don't have to, in fact, grieve for basically my son, my adopted son, or whatever. That would be one way why she says that at the end, because she seemingly contradicts, what Vale told her at the end, and that was one way of looking at this. I just don't think that the book gives enough room to this whole story, this specific question, which is one of the key sort of open questions or problems in the Redwall universe. Are some species inherently evil? It does not necessarily give enough room to it. Maybe children's books are not, or children's books written like Redwall with furry animals and so forth for a specific younger audience are not the place where you can explore such a heavy topic. And I don't know those things, right? I'm not an expert on writing children's books. I just think that it does sort of leave those things on the table and does sort of like an injustice to the whole question. And that's something where I'm very conflicted about it. Of course, the idea of being seen as evil and then, causing the death of possibly even your father and all... It has this element of Greek tragedy, which is once again why I think this book takes more from Greek mythology. It has the whole almost like Oedipus kind of storyline in a way, like growing up somewhere else and then trying to find out who you are and all of that. It does have that, but once again I feel it does not necessarily fully commit to how tragic this could be, partly by not giving Vale enough, like us as readers, not enough like idea of what is going on in Vale's inner world. We don't see his character develop much because there's not just not like that much time for him in the book, not that many pages. We focus much more on Six Claws and Sunflesh, which is why I said it feels like almost two books sort of crammed into one book in a way that doesn't always work out. And that's just like why I think it's so frustrating to me, is because this could have been a very interesting further exploration of what, people believing we are evil makes out of us. All of that could be in there, but it just feels messy, maybe. So that's certainly something that I find really annoying, because there's another element, of course, and we've spoken about that before, and that is, of course, foxes being, evil and full of anti-Sigonist stereotypes, which, because they are tied directly to Sinti, Romani people and so forth in the first book, is in there. This time around we have Nightshade the fox, who does all of these things. She even pretends to be a seer, prophetess, and she's tricksy, and she uses poison. She does all of these things again. It's like, are all foxes naturally evil? And in a sneaky way? Once again, we do that. We sort of apply human stereotypes and characteristics to animals all the time. That's how fables work, right? So I see where Brian Jacques is coming from, but he's leaning a lot into it in a problematic way. Obviously, the really insidious problem with anti-Sigonism is, of course, that it is much less discussed, or hasn't been discussed for a long time in a way that, say, anti-black racism has already. Most people understand what is an anti-black stereotype and why it is bad, unless they're, racists. With anti-Sigonist stereotypes, that is much less the case. So I kind of see where Brian Jacques is coming from, why these things are in there, but I still believe we need to sort of mention them because, yeah, it's bad. It's still bad, is my point. So yeah, that's roughly what I have for this specific book. As I said, it left me very much conflicted in ways that made me sad, because I was so happy with the previous one, The Bellmaker. And this one just doesn't fully, explore its themes. It feels like a lot of stuff was just like left on the cutting room floor, I guess, and that's sad. So yeah, let me know what you thought about it if you have read it. Seriously, with this one, I'm very, very thankful for every comment that you may have on this if you have read the book, because I don't know what to think about it. Hopefully, the next one, which is Pearls of Lutra, will be better. We'll find out tomorrow. And until then, thanks, cheers, and once again, Eulalia!